October. The year is 539 BC. The walls of Babylon rise ahead, the largest city on earth, the center of the known world, and its gates are standing open. No siege, no fire, no screaming in the streets. A king named Cyrus rides through, and the most powerful empire of its age changes hands in a single afternoon. Then he does something no conqueror before him had done. He does not loot the temples. He does not burn the archives or execute the priests. He walks to the quarters where the captives are held, and he sets them free, including tens of thousands of Jews held in Babylon for 2 generations. He pays for their journey home. He tells them to go and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. The Hebrew Bible delivers its verdict in a single word. Cyrus, a Persian, a foreigner, a man who worshipped other gods, is the only Gentile king in all its pages it ever calls Messiah, anointed, chosen by God. That one decision, made by a Persian king 25 centuries ago, runs in an unbroken line into the news you read this week. Because the empire that sent the Jews back to Jerusalem is the same civilization the world now calls Iran. And Iran has spent the last 4 decades promising to wipe the descendants of those exiles off the map. This is the story of how that empire was born and why it never really died. Block 2. The World Before. To understand why Cyrus mattered, you have to understand the world he was born into. A world with no such thing as an empire that lasted. Before Persia, power worked one way. A city or a people grew strong, conquered its neighbors, taxed them, crushed them, and waited for the day the conquered rose up and burned it all down. Assyria did this. Babylon did this. Empires were short, violent, and hated. They ruled by terror, because terror was the only tool they had. Cyrus was born around 600 BC in a minor kingdom called Persia, Pars, a stretch of highland in what is now southern Iran. His own people were vassals, subjects of a larger power, the Medes. By the standards of the age, he was nobody. Around 550 BC, he rose against the Median king, by some accounts his own grandfather, and won. Then he did not stop. He turned west and swallowed the kingdom of Lydia, and with it the legendary gold of King Croesus. He marched on Babylon, and the city opened its gates. In barely 20 years, a man from a backwater highland had assembled the largest empire the planet had ever seen. But conquest was the easy part. Everyone could conquer. The question that had destroyed every empire before his was simpler and crueler. How do you hold it? Cyrus answered with an idea so radical it still defines good government today. He did not erase the people he conquered. He let them keep their gods, their languages, their laws, their local rulers. A subject in Egypt stayed Egyptian. A subject in Babylon kept his temple. In exchange, they paid their taxes and they kept the peace. Rule by tolerance instead of terror. It had never been tried at scale. It worked. If you have never heard the Persian Empire described this way, as the inventor of the model that every large state still copies, that gap is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, and the rest of the empire's story comes with you. Cyrus's son Cambyses added Egypt to the map. But it was the third king, Darius I, who turned a conquest into a machine. Darius carved the empire into about 20 provinces called satrapies, each run by a governor, each watched by traveling inspectors the Persians called the King's Eyes and Ears, the world's first imperial intelligence service. He minted a standardized gold coin, the darik, so the entire empire traded in one currency. And he built the Royal Road, a single highway running roughly 1,700 miles from Sardis near the Aegean coast to the Persian capital at Susa. Relay stations lined that road, fresh horses and riders waiting at every one. A message that took 90 days to walk could now cross the empire in 7. The Greek historian Herodotus described those couriers with a line you may already know, that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor the darkness of night could stop them from their appointed route. Today that sentence is carved in stone above a post office in New York City. It was written originally about the Persians. At its height, the empire reached from the edge of India to the shores of Greece, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the deserts of Egypt. By the best estimates historians can make, it ruled close to half of every human being then alive on Earth. No empire before or since has ever governed a larger share of humanity. It looked eternal. It looked like the natural and permanent shape of the world. But the machine Darius built had one flaw welded into its core, a single weakness that no road, no coin, and no army could ever fix. And that flaw was about to decide everything. Block 3. The turning point. The flaw was this: the empire had no rule for who came next. When a Persian king died, the throne did not pass by clear law. It passed to whoever could seize it, whichever son, brother, or general moved fastest and killed the others first. Every succession was a civil war waiting to happen. The empire's stability rested entirely on the strength of one man at the top. A strong king, and it held. A weak one, and it shook. For a long time, the kings were strong enough even to absorb the one defeat that history would never let them forget. You know the story. You have seen the films. A small band of free Greeks stands against a vast Persian horde and saves Western civilization from Eastern tyranny. Marathon, 490 BC. Thermopylae and the 300. Salamis. The Greeks win. Freedom defeats despotism. Here is what those films do not tell you. To the Persian Empire, the Greek wars were a frontier disturbance, a failed expedition at the far western edge of a world that ran all the way to India. Persia lost some ships and some pride, shrugged, and went home. It remained the dominant power on Earth for another century and a half after Salamis, longer than the United States has existed as a country. So let me say something here that cuts against almost everything you were taught. We were told the Greeks saved the West from Persian tyranny. I think that is the most successful piece of propaganda ever written, and 25 centuries later, we are still reciting it. The story of free Greece against the slave empire was composed by Greeks, polished by Romans, and handed down to us as plain history. It is a magnificent story. It is also the version told by the side that, in the wider war, mostly lost. Persia was not killed by Greece. Persia was killed, slowly, by itself. After Darius, the kings got smaller. The succession flaw did exactly what it had always threatened to do. Sons murdered fathers, brothers murdered brothers. King Artaxerxes III secured his throne by having much of his own family killed, and was then poisoned by his own physician, on the orders of a court official named Bagoas. That same official poisoned the next king, too. The empire was no longer being conquered. It was eating itself from the throne down. And this was not new. Even Xerxes, the very king the films cast as the face of Persian might, did not fall in battle or die old in his bed. In 465 BC, he was murdered inside his own palace by the commander of his royal bodyguard. The empire's deadliest enemy was never Greece. It was the Persian court itself. The satraps, those provincial governors, grew rich and restless, and some raised private armies and rebelled. One revolt, late in the empire's life, saw a whole tier of Western governors rise together, the men the kings had trusted most, turning on the throne at once. The intelligence network frayed, the center weakened. By 336 BC, the throne landed on a distant royal cousin who took the name Darius III. He was not a tyrant and not a fool. He was simply a man who had inherited a magnificent house with rotten beams and no time left to repair them. Because that very same year, far to the northwest, in a rough, half-wild kingdom that Persia had spent 2 centuries dismissing as beneath its notice, a young man buried his murdered father, picked up the crown, and began to think about the East. His kingdom was called Macedon. His name was Alexander, and he had been raised on the Greek story of the slave empire, raised to believe that crossing into Persia would not be an invasion, it would be revenge. Block 4. The Fall. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia with roughly 40,000 men. Against him stood an empire that could field, in theory, several times that number. The numbers, in fact, are the first thing to set straight. Ancient writers loved to paint Persian armies as oceans of men, 1 million, 2 million, the earth itself moving. They were lying, or guessing, or flattering their own side. Modern historians think Darius never put much more than 100,000 men into a single battle. Still enormous. Still every time larger than Alexander's force. And still every time it lost. At the Granicus River, Alexander broke the satraps of the western provinces. A year later, at Issus in 333 BC, he met Darius himself. The Persian line cracked, and Darius, the king of kings, the heir of Cyrus, turned his chariot and fled the field. He fled so fast he left his own mother, his wife, and his children behind in the camp. Alexander captured the royal family of Persia without a fight. Think about what that did. In an empire where everything depended on the strength of one man, the entire world had just watched that man run. Darius offered terms. He offered Alexander half the empire, a fortune in gold, his own daughter in marriage. Alexander refused all of it. He did not want half. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, the two met for the last time. Darius had chosen flat ground and cleared it for his chariots and assembled everything the empire had left. And when the Persian center buckled, the King of Kings ran a second time. This time, his own men would not forgive it. Alexander walked into Babylon, then Susa, then Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, the city of the kings. And there the palaces of Darius and Xerxes burned. Whether Alexander ordered it in cold calculation or a drunken night simply got out of hand, historians still argue. The result was the same. The house that Cyrus built, 2 centuries of Persian glory, went up in flame and ash. If you had stood in that throne room as it burned, watching the greatest empire on earth come to an end, would you have called it justice or tragedy? Tell me in the comments. Your answer matters to this story more than you might think. As for Darius III, the last Achaemenid king died not at the hand of any Greek, but at the hands of his own. A satrap named Bessus, a cousin, took the fleeing king prisoner, stabbed him, and left him to die in a wagon beside the road. When Alexander's men found the body, Alexander reportedly covered it with his own cloak. Because here is the part the word conquest hides from you. Alexander did not come to erase Persia. He came to inherit it. He put on Persian robes. He kept the satrapy system, the roads, the administration, the entire machine that Darius had built. He married a noblewoman of the East, and later a daughter of Darius himself. He ordered his Macedonian officers to take Persian wives. He began to demand the Persian court ceremony that his own soldiers found humiliating. His men were horrified. They had marched across the world to defeat Persia, and instead watched their king become a Persian. They mutinied. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, at 32, with no working plan for who came next. The same flaw, the very same flaw, that had hollowed out Persia, now tore his own empire apart inside a single generation. And the ashes of Persepolis? They were not the end of Persia. Persia was about to do something almost no fallen empire has ever done. It was going to rise again. Twice. Block 5. What remained? When Alexander's generals finished carving up his conquests, the Persian heartland fell to a dynasty called the Seleucids, Greek-speaking, Macedonian-descended, foreign. It did not last. Within a century, a people from the northeast, the Parthians, pushed the Greeks out and took the old empire back. Rome learned what that meant in 53 BC. A Roman general named Crassus, one of the richest men who ever lived, the financial partner of Julius Caesar, marched east to win himself military glory. At a place called Carrhae, the Parthians annihilated him. Crassus died in the dust. Rome lost its eagles, the sacred standards of its legions, and spent decades negotiating to win them back. For the next 700 years, Rome, the superpower of the West, would have one hard eastern border it could never break. That border was Persia. In 224 AD, a new Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, took power and made the rivalry total. They rebuilt the empire of Cyrus almost to its old shape. They called their land Iranshar, the realm of the Iranians. The name Iran is not modern. It is 17 centuries old and older. The Sassanid Persians fought Rome and then Christian Byzantium for 400 years. In 260 AD, they did something no enemy of Rome had ever done. Near the city of Edessa, the Persian king Shapur captured a Roman emperor alive. Valerian, ruler of Rome, spent the rest of his life as a Persian prisoner. Persian rock carvings still show him kneeling. But the deepest thing Persia exported was not an army and not a border. It was an idea about the universe itself. The old Persian religion was Zoroastrianism, built on a single struggle running through all of creation, a god of light and truth against a spirit of darkness and the lie. It taught that history was going somewhere, that the dead would one day be judged, that there was a heaven for the just and a torment for the wicked, that a Savior would come at the end of time, and that good would finally win. When the Jews of Babylon were freed by Cyrus and lived for generations inside the Persian world, they met those ideas. Many scholars believe that is where concepts faint or absent in older Hebrew scripture, a devil, a coming day of judgment, an end of days, angels arranged in ranks, grew sharp and central. From Judaism, those ideas passed into Christianity, from both into Islam. If that is right, and it is one of the most quietly important ifs in all of history, then more than half the people alive today pray inside a frame that Persia helped to build. Then, in the 7th century, the end came for Sassanid Persia, not from Rome, not from the steppe, but from the southern desert. Armies carrying a new faith, Islam, poured out of Arabia. At Al-Qadisiyah, around 636 AD, and at Nahavand, a few years later, the Persian army was broken. By 651 AD, the last Sassanid king was dead, hunted down and killed, according to the story, by a local miller. The empire of fire temples and kings of kings was finished. Egypt fell to that same wave and became Arab. Syria became Arab. North Africa became Arab. Their languages replaced, their old identities dissolved into the new one. Persia did not. Persia took the religion. It refused the identity. It kept its own language, its poetry, its memory of Cyrus and Darius. And 4 centuries later, it would do something stranger still. It would choose a version of Islam that set it apart from every Arab neighbor it had, and that has shaped the Middle East from that day to this one. Block 6. The modern geopolitical hook. That choice has a date, 1501. In that year, a teenage ruler named Ismail seized Persia and declared that his empire would follow Shia Islam, the minority branch, the branch that had split from the majority over who held the right to lead the faith after the Prophet Muhammad. Almost the entire rest of the Muslim world was, and still is, Sunni. Ismail made Persia the great Shia power. He made it, once again, a thing apart. Look at a map of the Middle East today, and you are looking straight at the consequences. There is one large, powerful, Persian-speaking Shia-majority country sitting in a region that is overwhelmingly Arab and overwhelmingly Sunni. It does not blend in. It was never meant to. It is the direct descendant of the empire of Cyrus, and it still behaves like one. In 1935, the ruler of that country made it official. For centuries, the West had called the place Persia, a name the Greeks had coined from Pars, that single original province. But the people who lived there had called their land something else for 2,000 years. So Reza Shah asked the world to use the real name, the name that means the land of the Aryans. He asked the world to call it Iran. Now hold the two ends of this story in your hands at the same time. At one end, Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who freed the Jews from captivity, paid for their return, and ordered the temple in Jerusalem rebuilt. The only foreign ruler the Hebrew Bible ever calls anointed by God. At the other end, the modern Islamic Republic of Iran, born in the revolution of 1979, ruled by Shia clerics, whose official policy has, for more than 40 years, called for the elimination of the Jewish state. The same Jerusalem, the same people, the opposite intention. This is the connection this channel exists to show you. When you watch Iran and Israel trade strikes, when you hear about Iran's nuclear program and its enrichment of uranium, about its allied militias arming for fights from Lebanon to Yemen, You are not watching a quarrel that began in 1979 or in 1948. You are watching the latest movement of a civilization that has thought of itself as the natural center of the world for 2,500 years. Iran does not negotiate like a normal country. It negotiates like an heir. It carries the memory of having once been the largest empire on earth, and the memory of every power that ever humbled it, from Alexander to the Arab armies to the foreign companies that pumped its oil in the 20th century. That last wound is more recent than most Americans realize. In 1953, when Iran's elected government moved to take control of its own oil, British and American intelligence services helped overthrow it and put the Shah back in full power. To Washington, it was a Cold War operation. To Iranians, it became proof. Proof that the foreign powers still treated Persia as something to be managed, the way Alexander and the caliphs once had. And geography handed modern Iran a card no ancient king ever held. The entire northern coast of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow sea gate through which roughly a fifth of all the world's oil is shipped, belongs to Iran. The empire that once ruled half the planet's people now sits astride one of the most important choke points on Earth. When Iran wants the world's attention, it does not need an army. It needs only to point at that strait. And there is one object, small, made of baked clay, broken at one corner, that explains how Iran sees itself better than any speech ever could. Block 7. Main crate plus final development. If you have come this far, 25 centuries from the open gates of Babylon to the headlines of this week, then the rest of what this channel does was built for you. Subscribe and turn on the bell. Empires rise and fall on a schedule, and the next one we take apart should reach you the moment it goes up. Now. That object made of clay. It is called the Cyrus cylinder. It was made around 539 BC, the year Cyrus took Babylon, and it is covered in tiny wedge-shaped writing. In it, the king describes how he entered the city in peace, restored its temples, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homes. It was rediscovered in 1879, and today it sits in the British Museum in London. A replica of it sits at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. It has been called the first Charter of Human Rights in history. Now, I have to be honest with you here, because this channel does not trade in comfortable myths. Most scholars who study that cylinder will tell you the description is too generous. In form, it is a fairly ordinary Mesopotamian royal inscription, a new king announcing that he is kinder than the last one. Calling it a Charter of Human Rights is a modern idea laid over an ancient stone. But here is what is not a myth, and here is why the cylinder matters anyway. Whatever Cyrus meant by it, his empire genuinely did practice tolerance on a scale the ancient world had never seen. It genuinely did let the Jews go home. The behavior was real, even if the modern label is not. And in 1971, that cylinder became a political weapon. That year, the Shah of Iran, the last king Iran would ever have, threw one of the most extravagant celebrations in modern history. In the desert beside the ruins of Persepolis, the very city Alexander had burned, he raised a city of luxury tents and flew in royalty and presidents from all over the world. The food was catered by a celebrated restaurant flown in from Paris. The wine, the chefs, and the furnishings came from France, and the guests slept in air-conditioned tents arranged in a star around the ancient ruins. The bill, by most estimates, ran well past $100 million. The occasion? 2,500 years, he declared, of unbroken Persian monarchy in a line running straight back to Cyrus. He took the Cyrus cylinder as the emblem of the celebration. He stood at the tomb of Cyrus and spoke to the dead king out loud. Iranians did not all cheer. Many saw rulers spending a fortune on tents while villages still went without clean water. From exile, a cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini denounced the whole spectacle, the foreign luxury, the worship of a pagan monarchy, a king who would sooner toast a dead emperor than feed the living. Most Iranians had never heard their ancient history told in such lavish detail. They had, now, heard of Khomeini. 8 years later, in 1979, a revolution swept that Shah off his throne and out of his country, and replaced his monarchy with an Islamic republic that despised nearly everything he had stood for. The kings were finished. 25 centuries of monarchy, from Cyrus to the Shah, ended in a single year. But the thing underneath the kings, the civilization, the memory, the deep conviction of being Iran, that did not end. It simply changed clothes again. And it is still standing in front of us right now, in the simplest fact of this entire story. The one fact almost everyone misses. Block 8. The closing. Here is that fact. Egypt was conquered, and the Egypt of the pharaohs ended. Babylon was conquered, and Babylon ended. Rome fell, and Rome became a memory, a dead language carved on other people's buildings. The empires this channel walks through almost all share that same ending. They fall, and then they stop. They become history, something you study, not something you still are. Persia is the exception. The empire of Cyrus was conquered by Alexander, and it rose again as Parthia. Parthia gave way, and it rose again as the Sassanids. The Sassanids were broken by the armies of Islam, and Persia took the new religion, kept its own language, kept its own name, and a few centuries later chose its own branch of the faith, so that even its idea of God set it apart. Its kings were swept away in 1979, and the country underneath the kings did not so much as blink. 2,500 years, conquered again and again and again, and never once dissolved. That is the answer to the question hidden at the very start of this video. Why should a decision made by a Persian king reach into the news you read this week? Because in Iran, the past is not past. It is a living argument about who they are. Every side in Iran reaches for Cyrus. The Shah held him up as proof that kings were eternal. The Islamic Republic that destroyed the Shah would rather you forgot Cyrus altogether. A pagan emperor does not flatter a clerical state. And so, in recent years, ordinary Iranians who want neither a Shah nor an Ayatollah have begun gathering in their thousands at the tomb of Cyrus in the desert at Pasargadae, at the grave of a king dead for 25 centuries, and using a long-dead emperor to say out loud the things they are not otherwise allowed to say. The government has answered those gatherings with road closures and arrests, which tells you something precise about the power of a story. A modern state, with all the machinery a modern state can command, can still be unsettled by the memory of one ancient king. That is what an empire leaves behind when it has left behind everything else. Not its borders, those moved. Not its government, those fell over and over and over. It leaves a story a people tell about themselves. And a story, it turns out, is far harder to conquer than any city. The Persian Empire did not fall the way Rome fell. It never quite finished falling. It just kept changing shape. King to king, faith to faith, name to name, carrying one unbroken thread the entire way down. The certainty of being, and of always having been, the center of its own world. Rome left us its laws and its alphabet. Greece left us its philosophy. Persia left something harder to see and harder to kill. The idea that a people can lose every war, every dynasty, and every border it ever had, and still refuse, century after century, to stop being itself. Cyrus opened the gates of Babylon 25 centuries ago and let his prisoners walk home. The empire he built is long gone. The civilization he started is, right now, on the front page. A copy of the small clay cylinder he left behind sits in a glass case at the United Nations in New York, a short walk from the very rooms where the world still argues about Iran. If this is the kind of history you wish your teachers had told you, the kind that explains the world instead of just dating it, share this video with someone who still believes the past is over. And tell us in the comments, which empire should fall next? Whose gates should we open? Rome is waiting. So are the Ottomans. So are the Mongols. The thrones are all empty now. Pick one, and we will walk you through exactly how it ended.